In this presentation, we're going to discuss monopolies. Monopolist is the lone supplier of a good or service with no close substitute, and so they make up the entire industry. So how does some group become a monopolist? Well, then there typically needs to be barriers to entry that allow the firm to make long-run economic profits. Barriers to entry are just restrictions on who can start or stay in the business. A couple of examples of barriers to entry include ownership of resources without close substitutes, economies of scale, and legal or governmental restrictions. We'll discuss these in more detail. Ownership of resources without close substitutes. Here's an example. The Aluminum Company of America, or Alcoa, at one time owned most of the world's bauxite, giving it a monopoly power on the production of aluminum. Economies of scale. Low unit costs and prices drive out rivals. That is, if you produce at larger quantities and that leads to lower prices, you can produce the full range of demand at a lower price with a single producer. These two types of barriers to entry constitute natural monopolies. A natural monopoly arises from the peculiar production characteristics in an industry. It usually arises when there are large economies of scale. One firm can produce at a lower average cost than can be achieved by multiple firms. Here is an example of a couple of long-run cost curves. We have long-run average cost and long-run marginal cost curves. You see the decreasing curves here, which lead to natural monopolies. Legal or governmental restrictions include things such as licensure, franchises, and certificates of convenience. You can think of things like the electric company or radio and television stations as examples of monopolies due to these restrictions. Some specific legal restrictions would be patents or intellectual property, regulation, government enforcement of safety and quality, or tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods. Let's consider a situation where the government raises taxes on imported goods. What would happen? You might expect that only domestic companies would stay if the taxes got high enough, and so in a lot of markets you'd end up with very few firms or perhaps even single firms making monopolies in our economy. For instance, in the large jet aircraft industry, Boeing would become a monopoly because there are no other large aircraft companies within the United States. Clearly, the monopolist only faces the industry demand curve because they are the entire industry. Let's recall a few facts from perfect competition. First, in perfect competition, a firm faces a perfectly elastic demand curve. They're a price taker. This price is decided on by the market supply and demand curves. And marginal revenue, average revenue, and price are all the same. Now let's compare the two. The perfect competitor doesn't have to worry about lowering prices to sell more. They can always sell as much as they want at the given price. In a purely competitive situation, the firm accounts for a small part of the market, so it can sell its entire output. However, the monopolist has to lower the price to sell another unit. Recall that the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve because it's the only supplier in the economy. Here panel A shows the demand curve faced by a perfect competitor, and panel B shows the demand curve faced by a monopolist. This chart summarizes some of the facts we've mentioned. So the consequence of this downward sloping demand curve is that a monopolist can't just charge any price with no changes in quantity. Recall that revenue is just the price charged times the units. So we can calculate revenue by finding the area of this entire rectangle. However, marginal revenue is the increase in revenue from selling one more unit. So if we do this, we know that we're now shifting to this rectangle, where we sell 4 units instead of 3 units. So we can find marginal revenue by subtracting this area from this area. So what happens if a monopolist raises its price? Remember that the product of monopolist has no close substitutes, and that the demand curve slopes downward because individuals compare marginal satisfaction to cost. Just like the case of the perfect competitor, we assume that the monopolist is interested in profit maximization or loss minimization. Recall that the perfect competitor only has to decide on the profit maximizing output because price is given. That is their price taker. However, the monopolist has to find the profit maximizing price to output combination because the monopolist is a price searcher. A price searcher is just a firm that must determine the price output combination that maximizes profit because it faces a downward sloping demand curve. We can find this profit maximizing combination by either looking at total revenues and total costs or looking at marginal revenues and marginal costs. The total revenues and total costs approach just finds the largest positive difference between total revenues and total costs. The marginal revenue and marginal cost approach, similar to that of the perfect competitor, just wants to equal marginal revenue and marginal cost. So why do we want to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost? This is just because that's where the greatest positive difference between total revenue and total cost occurs. We'll see this graphically in the following slides. Here's a chart of some economic calculations at various output levels. In panel B, we can see, again, similar to our calculations with perfect competition, that profit is maximized where total revenues is farthest above total costs. Also, we can see that where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, here we're again profit maximizing. So what happens if we produce past where marginal revenue equals marginal cost? Then the incremental cost will exceed incremental revenue. That is, it's going to cost us more to produce one more item than we'll receive in revenue, and so we'll take a loss on that item. What if we produce less than where marginal revenue equals marginal cost? Then we could conceivably produce one more unit, and it would cost us less than what we would make on that one more unit, and so we're giving up profit by not doing this. Here we can see this graphically. From A to B, this would be the amount of profit that we're giving up by not producing the next unit. Here, there's no profit to be gained by producing another unit, and there's also no loss by producing a less unit. And here, we're producing at a point where it's costing us more than it's making us. Price searching for anyone other than a perfect competitor is a process. The monopolist can only estimate what the demand curve is. There's no given demand curve for any particular industry. However, a perfect competitor is given a price where market demand and market supply intersect, and so they don't have to search for it. This is why a monopolist is a price seeker. In the upcoming figure, we'll see monopoly profit and where it's calculated graphically. Here, we're producing where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal. This quantity, we have an average total cost at this point, so each unit cost us, on average, this amount. And at the demand curve at this quantity, we receive this price. So the difference between the price per unit we get and the average cost of that unit is the profit per unit. And so if we multiply that times the quantity sold, we get the area of this rectangle as the total profit. The monopolist may not necessarily create a profit. For instance, if the average total cost is above the average revenue, or the demand curve, at every conceivable output, then the monopolist can't cover its cost, and so it's making a loss if it produces at all. Here we can see this graphically. Average total cost is above demand at every point. So even if we're producing at the maximum profit point slash minimum loss point, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, we're operating at an average total cost higher than our price per unit, and we have a loss. Price discrimination. This is selling a given product at more than one price, with the difference being unrelated to differences in cost. For example, consider student discounts at the movie theater, where if you're a student, you receive a lower price for the exact same product. Price differentiation. This is establishing different prices for similar products to reflect differences in marginal cost and providing those commodities to different groups of buyers. Necessary conditions for price discrimination. The firm must face a downward sloping demand curve. The firm must be able to readily and cheaply identify buyers or groups of buyers with predictably different elasticities of demand, and the firm must be able to prevent resale of the product or service. Textbook publishers have practiced a form of price discrimination for a while. They charge higher prices to students in higher income nations like the US and lower prices to lower income countries like Thailand. The publishers thought that they could maximize their global profits through this. However, Supreme Court rulings have stated that United States citizens can buy cheaper books from Thailand, so they can no longer price discriminate effectively. Let's compare a market that was a perfect competition market with a monopoly market. So let's assume a monopolist purchases all the competitors in a perfect competition market. Then we'd expect that the price is higher and the quantity is lower. The monopolist raises the price and restricts production compared to a perfectly competitive situation. And so consumers pay a price that's higher and resources are misallocated in such a situation. In panel A, we see the price that would be the set market price in a perfect competition market. This is where the total supply curve and the total demand curve intersect. However, if that market was to shift to a monopolist market, we would see the marginal revenue curve come into effect because it's a single producer, and so he would produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. This quantity would end up providing a higher price than the previous market.